I recently made a comment on a post that was done on TikTok regarding self-defense and the UK law in response of self-defense and what you're entitled to do if somebody pushes you. I made a comment just saying that wasn't quite correct, and this guy has put a reply to that, and he did explain it a little bit better, but I'd like to add a little bit more to it than that, because it's not just as plain and simple as that. In the UK, the concept of reasonable force is central to self-defense law. Now, when we're faced with a physical altercation, such as being pushed by another person, understanding what actually constitutes as reasonable force is really crucial for responding appropriately whilst staying within the bounds of the law. So what is reasonable force? In simplistic terms, reasonable force is the degree of physical intervention that's necessary in order to protect yourself or others from harm, whilst also considering the circumstances of the situation at hand. Now, it's really a legal principle that allows us to defend ourselves or others against any imminent threat using force that is proportionate and necessary. Remember, proportionate and necessary in the given circumstances. Now, you've got to remember, different circumstances warrants different reactions. So these are the things that we must consider. First is the imminence of threat. Now, in assessing reasonable force, it's really important to consider whether the threat was imminent and immediate. A push, whilst that may seem aggressive, may not always constitute as imminent threat or serious harm. Then we have to look at proportionality. The level of force must be proportionate to the threat that we're facing. Now, responding to a push with equal force or even excessive force can be deemed unreasonable in the eyes of the law. Then we have necessity. The use of force must be necessary to protect yourself or others from harm. If an alternative measure, such as de-escalation or retreat, could have been taken in order to avoid that physical intervention, then the use of force might be considered unreasonable. Then we must look at subjective belief. Now, the law will consider the person's subjective belief in the necessity of using that force. If you genuinely believed that the push posed a threat to your safety or the safety of another person, disbelief would be taken into account when assessing the reasonableness of your response. So, what's the response to being pushed? So, in that sort of scenario, such as being pushed by another person, the appropriate response would depend on them circumstances. Now, first of all, we have the assessment of the threat. You've got to assess the situation to determine whether the push posed a genuine threat of harm or injury. Now, factors such as the aggressor's intent, the aggressor's demeanour, and any verbal threats should also be considered. Then we need to look at de-escalation. We need to attempt to diffuse the situation through verbal communication and non-confrontational gestures. Now, if the aggressor is willing to disengage, it might be possible to resolve the conflict peacefully without even resorting to any type of physical force. Then we look at self-defense. So if you believe that the push constituted a threat to your safety, you have the right to use reasonable force to defend yourself. However, the force you use should be proportionate to the threat and in order to protect yourself from harm. Then we need to look at retreat. Now, if it's safe to do so, you need to consider retreating from the situation rather than engaging in any physical confrontation. Avoid escalating the conflict unnecessarily and prioritise your safety above everything else that you look at. Then we need to look at legal consequences. So if you use force in self-defence, it's essential to be prepared for potential legal consequences. Now, while the law allows for use of reasonable force to protect yourself or others, Each case is going to be assessed based on its individual circumstances. Now, it's advisable to cooperate with the police and seek legal advice if necessary in order to ensure that your actions were in accordance with the law. So, to weigh up, the concept of reasonable force under UK law provides people with the right to defend themselves from physical harm. When faced with a situation where force might be necessary, it's really important to assess the threat, consider proportionality and necessity, and prioritise non-confrontational resolution whenever you can. Now, by understanding and adhering to these principles of reasonable force, you can protect yourself while remaining within the bounds of the law. So we was talking about assessment, weren't we? So you need to understand means, opportunity and intent. So when we face a threat, you've got to reasonably believe that the aggressor has the physical ability or weaponry to cause you harm. Now, if an aggressor is unarmed and significantly weaker than you are, then the level of force that you can justify in self-defense will be lower. Then we have opportunity. So the threat must be immediate and also present. And if the aggressor doesn't have the opportunity to use the means of causing you harm, then the justification for self-defense is going to be a bit difficult. So, for example, if the aggressor's on the other side of a locked door or at a distance where they can't immediately harm you, then the opportunity might not be present. Now, conversely, if they are in close proximity and they can strike you at any moment, then the opportunity is obviously clear. Then we have intent. So the intent must be evident for a claim of self-defense in order to be valid. Now, this means that the aggressor must demonstrate through their actions or the words that they intend to cause you harm. So verbal threats, aggressive movements, or an attempt to reach for a weapon can actually indicate immediate intent. Now, the perceived intent of the aggressor plays a crucial role in determining whether the response was reasonable or not. So we need to look at applying means, opportunity and intent in self-defense. So imagine a situation where you're confronted by a person who's verbally threatening and reaches into the jacket as if they're going to pull out a weapon. Now, here's how you would analyse means, opportunity and intent. So first of all, let's look at means. So the person's action of reaching into the jacket suggests that they might have a weapon. Then we have opportunity. So the close proximity means that they could use the weapon quickly. But then we have the intent. So the verbal threats and the aggressive posture indicate there may be an intention to harm you. So in this type of scenario, you could reasonably believe that you're in imminent danger and you might need to act in self-defense. So the legal justification in that is, under UK law, to legally justify the use of force in self-defense, you must have necessity. So the force used must be necessary to prevent you harm. Then we have to have proportionality. So the level of force must be proportionate to the threat. Excessive force, even in self-defense, can lead to legal consequences. Then we need immediacy. So the threat must be immediate. Preemptive strikes or retaliatory actions after the threat has subsided are generally not justified. So let's look at the legal framework and case law. So first we'll look at statutory provisions. Under Criminal Law Act of 1967, Section 3, provides that a person might use reasonable force in the prevention of crime or in effecting or in assisting in the lawful arrest of offenders or suspected offenders. Then in common law, it allows for self-defence where an individual reasonably believes it is necessary to defend themselves from others or from imminent harm.